Hi everyone, this is Tom West. I teach a course at CalU in our master's program called Nutrition for Peak Performance. I am not a nutritionist, I am an athletic trainer, and have had a number of courses in exercise physiology and physiology and have a deep interest in how the body works. And if you're interested in maximizing performance, a big part of that is nutrition. So I love teaching this class because, again, I'm always learning new things, and that's because nutrition is a field that continues to advance. We continue to learn more and more about how the body processes macronutrients, micronutrients, how they impact performance, and so on. There are also always a wealth of new diets, new supplements that come into the market that we need to consider and learn about if we want to provide the best information for our clients and our athletes and point them in the direction of good resources so they can make good choices in regard to their nutrition. One question that always comes up is protein supplementation and its relationship to resistance training and exercise as a whole. So again, in my class, we cover this in depth. There is a good bit of controversy still on this topic, however, and I put this video together one to put on my blog, but also to use in my class to kind of give a second viewpoint on aspects related to protein supplementation. So in general, in my class, we talk about protein intake. And again, as one of the macronutrients, protein is an important part of our diet, especially somebody that's physically active, because they're going to utilize that protein to build new tissue and to enhance the constant turnover of tissue that occurs in normal life anyway. An athlete or someone who exercises regularly, and especially somebody who does resistance training, has an increased need for protein. And generally, most sources are going to recommend that they need a greater volume of protein than the average person because of this increased anabolic activity, building of tissue that occurs in the body in response to this exercise. So in general, I think everyone agrees that athletes, and especially those that do resistance training, are going to need an increased amount of protein intake. Some questions arise, though, about whether the timing really makes a difference. There does seem to be some very solid evidence that indicates that right after activity, especially resistance training activity that utilizes skeletal muscle in a very intense fashion, we have a window of time, 2 to 4 hours, where the body seems to ramp up muscle protein synthesis. Again, the healing and the restoration and the increase in the proteins found in skeletal muscle that are involved in contraction and so on, and also involved in building the connective tissue component of muscle. So there's some evidence that says that potentially taking protein in during that anabolic window or even just prior to exercise can further enhance protein synthesis and increase the rates of hypertrophy and increase the rates of building strength, power, and so on. So this is something that most people believe as a fact, something that we can all agree upon. However, there's some evidence now showing that maybe that isn't the case. So, and this first kind of came to light, for me at least, last year, or 2017, in the ACSM newsletter. There was a news brief in the ACSM newsletter that kind of examined some studies and looked at maybe protein intake is important, but the timing of it does not necessarily make a difference. So that's what I wanted to talk about in this presentation. In my class, we talk a lot about how intake timing can be very important, but in this video, I wanted to argue with myself and say that it may not be as important as we think it is. With a lot of things in nutrition, there is a lot of debate back and forth, but I do think that the evidence is starting to show that protein intake is important, but timing may be less important than we thought it was. So let's start, though, by talking about the ACSM position statement that's titled Nutrition and Athletic Performance. This document was put out by the ACSM several years ago. Great resource on macronutrients, micronutrients, and some supplements. I encourage everybody to take a look at it. It's referenced, and I have a link at the end of this presentation. But obviously, there's some things that I think still the literature seems to agree upon, and there's some things that are going to be a little more controversial. But protein is a substrate, meaning it's a molecule, a substance that's used to build tissue, but there is also some evidence that it's a trigger for muscle protein synthesis. And there are a number of studies that show that if we take in protein and don't change anything else, there is a slight uptick in muscle protein synthesis. Protein intake also seems to be important for, obviously, the maintenance of tissues and most importantly for athletes, skeletal muscle tissue and the connective tissue component of muscle. So again, we have to have enough protein in our diet to build this muscle. In individuals that fast or don't take in adequate amounts of protein, we do see that muscle protein synthesis is diminished and hypertrophy rates are decreased. Resistance training and other types of exercise enhances protein synthesis or protein accretion in skeletal muscle. So again, we can build muscle more quickly by, again, performing these types of exercises. The ACSM position statement goes on further to say that athletes obviously need to take an increased amount of protein compared to the RDA and recommend an intake of approximately 1.2 to 2.0 grams per kilogram of body weight per day. And again, there are examples where increased amounts of protein may be needed in cases of extreme training and so on. The position statement also further recommends that 10 grams of essential amino acids, high quality protein supplement or a protein meal, be taken in 0 to 2 hours after exercise, and that this may increase muscle protein synthesis further, more than just exercise by itself, yielding an increased both performance gains and muscle protein synthesis. This last part is what I want to focus this presentation on, because there's more and more evidence that says that this benefit, this taking in protein or extra protein during this window, may in fact play no role in increasing performance. Won't necessarily hurt performance, but doesn't lead to an increased gain over the long period. But again, that's what I want to discuss in this presentation. So this Active Voice article, the article that kind of got me thinking about, hey, are we thinking about protein in the wrong way? I linked to here. It was published in 2017 by RASMUSSEN and Rasmussen, and they say a couple things that I think are really important and got me thinking. The first being that protein supplementation is a several billion-dollar industry that's supported by strong dogma. So a lot of the claims that people make in regards to protein intake and, more importantly, the timing of protein intake may not be supported by the literature, and that's what they're trying to argue in their piece in this Active Voice article. They also argue that, again, protein supplementation effects are present. Again, we need to take an adequate amount of protein supplementation, but the timing of the supplementation does not necessarily seem to pose a benefit. And if it does, that's acute over the short term. And if a person is eating an adequate amount of protein all the time, those intake timings are really not important. Don't give us any additional gains beyond just exercise alone. Again, assuming the person has adequate protein intake. So this kind of opened up a can of worms as to, does it really matter when we take in this protein? I know a lot of the athletes that I've seen and worked with and talked to, and a lot of the other individuals in this class, they recommend, that chocolate milk right after a workout or that protein supplement right after a workout to get additional gains. But it seems that might work in a very short period of time. But if the person has adequate protein intake, there really doesn't matter when they take their protein in. That they summarize an article, a research article that they've also published, that found that protein and amino acid supplements combined with resistance training exercise produced a positive but minor effect on the promotion of lean mass growth. So there was some effect in the studies that they summarized on lean mass growth, but there was no significant effect on, strength or other performance measures. So it seems that maybe as long as we take in enough protein throughout the day on a regular basis, the timing of that intake doesn't matter. let's take a closer look. There's a couple articles that these two individuals were involved in writing out in the literature, and I really encourage you to take a look at them. I have gotten produced again a link at the end of this presentation for you to take a look at. But the first one was published by Reedy and Rasmussen in 2017 in the Journal of Nutrition, and they did an exhaustive review of the literature. I mean, hundreds of articles that they summarized the data. They created great charts, great tables that show the findings of multiple studies looking at various things, and tried to tease out what are the benefits or the effects of exercise on muscle protein synthesis, what are the effects of protein supplementation on muscle protein synthesis, and then every combination of the two. I do encourage you to read it. It is really intense, so you'll be exhausted at the end of it, but you'll learn a lot about muscle protein synthesis, some of the biochemical reactions that are part of that, as well as some of the effects of supplementation in general, as well as the effects of exercise on protein synthesis. It's a really good kind of review of some of the mechanisms of how the body processes these things and then produces skeletal muscle and the connective tissue component of skeletal muscle. They found a number of things in their review that I think are interesting. There's a lot more in their article, but some of the things that I really found interesting is that resistance training, on average, when they looked at all of these different studies, does increase muscle protein synthesis. So the literature as a whole supports that resistive training increases muscle protein synthesis. On average, there was a pretty wide range, but on average, when you look at all the studies, at about 65%. So you get about 65% increase in the rate of protein synthesis in skeletal muscle when someone performs intense resistive training. They also found that there was an increase in muscle protein synthesis within the myofibril of the muscle itself, which is really probably the most important because that's the contractile portion of the skeletal muscle. They also found that there was an increase in muscle collagen synthesis of up to 89% in response to resistance training. So again, evidence shows resistance training certainly increases the rate of skeletal muscle protein synthesis. Muscle protein synthesis timing does seem to peak about 2 to 3 hours post-exercise. So we do get, right after exercise, a fairly rapid building of skeletal muscle and, again, synthesis of protein within muscle. They attempted to tease out the effects of resistance training combined with amino acid or protein supplementation. And they pointed to the real difficulty of doing that. And they pointed to the difficulty of comparing studies because the studies that they summarize used all different types of resistance training methods. They used different types of amino acid supplementation, different supplements, different amounts of protein, different timings, and so on. But again, they tried to look past that and look at, in general, did the timing of supplementation seem to play an effect in enhancing the protein synthesis that occurs in response to resistance training? So what did they find in this article? They found that protein intake increases acute exercise stimulation of some of the physiological responses. So if the person was taking in enough protein, that did further enhance the benefits conveyed by resistance training. However, they did not find that the timing played a difference. The study showed a small, possibly insignificant benefit or positive effect on lean muscle mass that we saw in individuals that timed the protein supplements in that anabolic window after working out. There was a slight improvement in body lean mass, a decrease in body fat and an increase in body lean mass. But it was so small, it was statistically significant, but it was so small that it maybe isn't practically significant. They found no effect or little to no effect when you combined resistance training and amino acid supplementation during the anabolic window on strength, muscle strength, or overall muscle mass. So again, a lot of the things that we kind of have been thinking are true, maybe are not. So maybe the timing doesn't play a part, although overall intake does. So the conclusions that Reedy and Rasmussen make in their lit review basically, again, give some guidance, but are contradictory to some of what you may have heard or thought to be the case with protein. supplementation. So again, they found that during exercise training, so in response to exercise, the body not only generates muscle protein more quickly, but it becomes more efficient in utilizing the amino acids that are available for muscle protein synthesis, which means that we may not necessarily need that boost of protein right after exercise because our body becomes better at using the protein that's already available. So that assumes that we have already a diet that has adequate amounts of protein. So that timing of supplementation maybe doesn't play as big of a role as we may expect. Although there does seem to be some benefits acutely when a person starts doing this supplementation, but then they seem to go away after time. They quote another article that's by Humi et al., and this I want to read to you, but they state, and then REIDY and Rasmussen agree with, they state that while positive effects of protein and amino acid ingestion on muscle hypertrophy signaling can often be clear when studied acutely after exercise, especially when performed in a fasting state, the long-term positive effects may not be that robust as due to normally daily high protein intakes. So what they're saying, as well as this other article by Humi, is that if we have adequate amounts of protein available all of the time, this timing of supplementation really doesn't play a part. It does if we are in a fasting state. If we have not eaten, we exercise first thing in the morning and we're maybe already low on protein, supplementing some protein after the workout would be a great idea because we need to have protein available to build this muscle. So if you're in a fasting state, that supplementation may make sense and be good practice. However, if we've got enough protein already in the blood, because our body is more efficient at utilizing that protein following exercise, the need to supplement right after a workout is not necessarily needed. Again, except when we're in this fasting state. So what ends up being most important is making sure that our daily protein intake is enough to support the activity that we're engaging in. And if we follow the ACSM guidelines and other organizations' guidelines for athletes and physically active, again, boosting up protein intake beyond the normal RDA for the average person, we're probably going to be okay. So a diet with sufficient levels of amino acids should support the needs of skeletal muscle during resistance training and other types of exercise. However, the converse, a diet that is insufficient in essential amino acids and insufficient in total protein intake, there is no debate that this will impact muscle protein synthesis in a negative way and impact strength and mass gains. So while there is some debate on the timing of protein intake, there does not seem to be debate on the need to increase total protein intake for athletes and the fact that insufficient intake of protein is going to have a fairly negative effect on performance gains in an athletic population that's engaging in exercise, specifically resistance training. So the conclusions, what to do, okay? If you read this article, there's a lot of good information, but again, we need to boil it down to what does that mean? What should we do? That says that athletes, people that exercise, individuals that are involved in resistance training must have adequate protein intake. So it's really good for them to periodically track their protein intake, and why not track all of their macronutrients from time to make sure they're getting that increased range of protein intake that's recommended by the ACSM and others. Also, it probably points to the fact that protein intake does not matter, the timing of it does not matter so much as long as we are taking protein in throughout the day and have some available floating through our bloodstream right after we exercise. It does not give any reason to not supplement, however. There didn't seem to be any evidence that says if you do choose to supplement with protein right after exercise, that there was any negative consequence, aside from potentially the cost of the supplements, aside from potentially the calories that it adds to your diet if you're concerned about body mass. That's the negatives. But there didn't seem to be a negative effect of trying to take in some protein right after an exercise program. So again, that's something to keep in mind as well. But again, I think what this keeps bringing us back to, and I think we'll see this as a theme whenever you're looking at nutritional questions and nutritional intake for any group of individuals, that we should always be focusing on having a diet that gets us the adequate amount of macronutrients that we need and micronutrients. And we should be eating a diet that is high quality foods, not a lot of excess calories. And again, we should be paying attention to the quality of the foods that we eat. So I think that's important. The other thing that I think is always important when we get to nutritional concepts and recommendations is we have to keep the individual client's needs in mind. So if they like to take in some protein right after an exercise bout, if that's the best time for them to do so, then have them do that if they're comfortable doing it. So again, we have to keep the individual clients' needs in mind in mind when we make recommendations and point them to good sources of information. So anyway, there was a lot of information covered in this presentation. There's a lot more in the articles that I've discussed. So I've listed them all here. There's links as well, both in the blog and in the course. So again, I encourage you to check them out because they have some really interesting information and really review how protein is utilized by the body in response to resistance training. Hopefully this was of interest to you and you learned some useful information that you can pass on to your clients.